Some of the panelists and I were talking over the lunch break around the themes from this morning, about the challenges of Brexit, about the challenges of US investment, about the challenges of a skills shortage. And whether it's the extra shot of espresso or the extra slice of cake, I think some of us decided we want to have a little bit of optimism in the next session. So I'm going to ask the panelists to come up to the stage. But whilst they do so, we're going to play a short video which reflects some of those 5 pledges from Manifesto 2030.
Is worth around £70 billion per year, and typically we invest around £3 billion in R&D every year.
We need government action now and in the next Parliament to deliver on the promise of 2030, a UK automotive industry that leads and succeeds in a net zero world.
With the right strategy and framework, we can accelerate the way that we attract investment into the UK and ensure the continuation of our industry for decades to come.
Ultimately, a competitive environment puts the UK on the global stage. Well, Konstanze, government needs to act now is a nice segue into the new SMMT report. What are the key themes? What are the key challenges that were identified?
Thank you, Jonathan. I think we are all really excited that today we can launch our Manifesto 2030. As you say, it's all about timing. We are probably just sort of 18 months or less even away from a general election. And we really felt it was the time to come out with those core themes that we believe we can actually unify all parties behind to drive our industry. And there are really 5 pledges that we would like policymakers to really unite behind it. And the first one, really to invest in a green automotive transformation strategy is probably the overarching one, because the game has changed really. It's not like we haven't looked as an industry already at what do we need to do strategically or how do we build up our ecosystem. But with US IRA, which got mentioning a lot of times, and also the EU reaction to this, we really need to rethink how we do this, and we need to do it now. And we heard it from Secretary of State. It's understood, we need to do something now. And we look forward to hearing what it is. From our perspective, it just really need to be, it's not like the UK doesn't have a package. It needs to just make it really, really a compelling offer, visible, communicably simple, accessible, we heard early on, to really drive investment into UK. It's a global investment game here. We need to make sure that we work with the businesses that are here, that are all wanting to transform, OEM, supply chain, new investors, and make sure that's on the card. So that's the green automotive strategy that we need to try and put forward. But it's not just about manufacturing. Manufacturing and market need to be hand in hand. And as you know, we are the 2nd largest market in Europe, despite not yet have fully recovered, but we are on the way of recovering from Brexit and from COVID. And the positive undertone of the positive undertone or trend that you saw in the figures that even throughout COVID you could have seen is just the rise of the percentages of battery electric and electrified vehicles. It's really transforming before our eyes, and we need to make sure that we have net zero mobility for all. Mike mentioned it earlier on. This is about infrastructure, not just for passenger cars, but we just heard it for buses as well, depots and HGV. We published just recently a paper that talked about, okay, we are looking at cars and vans, but we also need to do it for heavy heavy goods vehicles. You want to invest once, you want to do it all once. So really important that we do that. So get your market measures and your infrastructure measures right, so nobody's left behind from this. Skills, you had a whole panel on it. You know, we could spend the whole day on it, but it's so important, and it is both a skills issue, electrification and digitalization, but it's now also a labor issue for us. So we really need to think forward as part of this strategy. You know, how can we, yes, build the skills here, and automotive is a huge leader in apprenticeships. They're all coming back. We are getting there again, but we need to reskill and upskill our staff in electrification and digitalization. And we need government to be behind it, to have that national skills platform. So really, really important. That is, I think, on any OEMs and wider industry mind. So we need to help our whole industry to do it. And then rules of origin was already touched upon. I think from a strategic perspective, the United Kingdom absolutely needs to have a policy towards trade and investment that's open, that's absolutely not protectionist going forward. Instead, it needs to put automotive and our new supply chains that are really global out there, and to provide continued access for our products. We are an export leader. You know, 24 billion, 10 billion are electric vehicles are exported. So we need to make sure that all the deals we strike, and in particular our relationship with the EU, retains tariff-free access for our products and vice versa. Really important. And then last but not least, you know, this whole transformation is really a systemic transformation. You know, we as a sector have a real stake in the energy sector doing its bit. And the UK has big ambition for getting clean, affordable, sustainable, renewable energy there. But investment needs to be really, really driven to get to that one. And we want it, because all the manufacturers here, they don't just want the vehicles to be zero emission, they want actually the production to decarbonize. And that is competitive for the UK. That makes production of batteries competitive in the UK and others. So the price needs to come down, but we also need the ability to access that energy. So those are the 5 things.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because I think we've looked at the fact that it is a very difficult operating environment right now. And Michael, you know, it's, for the last 12 months, it's been really tough. Where do you see the position now? Where do you think we are sitting in the ecosystem?
I mean, it's an interesting question. If you look back over the sort of 3 or 4 years, this perfect storm has lasted for too long now. You know, we've gone from Brexit through COVID, the terrible war in Ukraine, the supply chain problems that all brought to us, the rising energy costs, the inflationary pressures on wages. And frankly, I don't believe we're out of it yet. We're still seeing some challenges which maybe we hadn't anticipated before we expect to come back to normal, and it hasn't quite happened. So in the past year, I think what we've seen is the big global supply chain problems have started to almost polarize into some very local issues. And I'm interested in Chris's point here, because in the small vehicle niche area, I think we've seen a concentration of issues which are very unique to the fact that we're low volume, high value, and maybe haven't got the robustness of the supply chain at the moment that we would like. The very good thing is that from a high luxury car buyer's perspective, there's a market there which has been very good ever since COVID. So there was a bounce back, there was a recovery which was very strong, and we've seen that hold up. The biggest problem is getting cars out to customers. So on the subject of the supply chain issue, I think what's really critical is that we've got a transition from internal combustion engines to full battery electric vehicles, maybe passing through a hybrid phase, depending on the sector you're working in. And as Konstanze says, this is really important we get this piece right. You know, we've got to get this UK-centric supply base for full battery electric vehicles clarified and start to get some investment in the company, whether it's startups, or whether it's inward investment. You know, we have to make sure that we're attractive for other countries, other manufacturers to want to invest in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, I think just picking up on some of those points, it's, you know, these perfect storms that we've come out the back of, and as a small OEM, we feel that we're at the knife edge of facing a lot of this readjustment that everyone's now waking up to. It's the instability within the regulatory framework, the uncertainty that everyone needs to make the investments for the next generation of product while still maintaining what they're doing today is a huge piece that we need to overcome. In terms of the vulnerability within that supply chain, you know, we're in this phase of talking about decoupling or de-risking the supply chain as a whole from where we've naturally found ourselves leading towards, where we can get simplicity, we can get assurance on price, we can get certainty. But for me, I find that sort of, in itself, it's kind of blaming a situation rather than coming up with a solution and recognizing where our skill set sits within it. Because, we have lots of manufacturers with hundreds of years of history between us. Specialism, skills, university, automotive groups, policy advisors, frameworks, infrastructure that allows us to do a lot more than some of our counterparts can, that are also building that industry themselves from scratch. So it's finding where we are within the niche and then owning that with the right policies, with the right investments, with the right sort of support that drives it forward, that will hopefully then help us overcome these inflationary pressures that are on us now and we will be seeing for the next several years ahead of us. I think, as Konstanze pointed out, that it's such a complicated framework that we are all just coming to grips with in revolutionizing this industry from a mindset of it's not just putting a battery in, it's creating the entire ecosystem that took 100 years to get to this maturity, and now we're trying to do it in a 10, 15-year turnaround cycle. So there's a lot of optimism there. It's just, for me, focusing in on where we can be great, recognizing the skills that sit, and then trying to support the supply chain in delivering into those channels.
I quite like that phrase, where we can be great. We kind of looked at the pressures of Brexit, we looked at de-risking with China, we looked at US investment policy. Konstanze, which countries do you think are doing really well in this space, and what do you think the UK could learn from them?
This is a nice poison challenge question. But I think first of all, I do think something that Kemi Bandunak said early on is 100% true. We would all agree with this, that we need to find a UK solution to all of this. But I think there's no getting away from it, the game-changing nature of the US intervention, which is very much focusing investment over there and the reaction of the EU. But if you look, as I say, closer to home, it's not that any one country has found the holy grail of how to do this. We are all grappling with very similar things that need to suddenly be sped up. The reform of planning, permitting, getting the processes faster going forward. But we have to say that obviously what's happening at the moment, say in Spain with their programs that they, with the relaxed EU subsidy program, can move forward and greater intensity of help. There's something to look at where you need to try and look at what's happening in Germany on semiconductor support, whether you get your scale right, working with industry, and looking at France, of course, just over the channel. There's so much investing having gone, and there's a strategy led from the front. So I do hope that when we are engaging with our manifesto as an industry, with all policymakers, regional, local, as well as the national ones, that we really get across this needs to be an all-government approach, so that we are there building on the strengths of the UK, which is this diverse industry, maybe target what our package is, but do make it really clear what the offer is and work with the industry to try and deliver it. That would be my best advice.
So if we take that idea of kind of targeting, Philippa, we talked this morning about innovation, and I promised everyone we would have some optimism post-lunchtime. So, how can the UK use that to our advantage, with the zero emissions, for example?
Yeah, well, I think the key here is, the UK is known, and it's been said by many people, innovation is where we're at, but it's really about that industrialisation and that scale up that we've got to do and support those businesses. And just sort of, going back actually and trying to learn from history a little bit, the Advanced Propulsion Centre is 10 this year, and if you look at that 10-year period of time, the innovation ecosystem has changed. So if you look at an example, what we've done is, if you look at the pipeline of projects that were coming through our research and development, yes, they were looking at efficiencies in the internal combustion engine. We've now seen that trajectory towards electric vehicles and electrification, looking at hydrogen solutions for some of those heavier duty vehicles as well. So we're seeing this transition, we're on that road. But not only that, we then saw the evolution of things like the Faraday Battery Challenge, recognising that there was a need for investment in that battery technology and that battery capability to deliver on that scale. So that again happened during that 10-year. And then during that time, one of the things we recognised was actually you needed that investment in capital. And there was a need for some investment in capital that fed into the Automotive Transformation Fund. And yes, this is part of the investment, and the investment is still reliant on the large OEMs putting the larger amount of investments in, but it helps de-risk that investment. So an example is you can look at Ford. They did around 7 R&D projects with us. So actually that helped develop their skills and their capability of their workforce towards that electrification journey. They then got the investment in the Harewood facility, which saw that plant transition from a transmission plant into an EDU plant. So that's those skills, that workforce, enabling that technology and that capability to be retained here in the UK. But like everyone says, I think, that long-term commitment enabled industry to de-risk some of their investments, and so we need that long-term commitment. But also it is about thinking about what we're good at and actually having some strategic goals and prioritisation about potentially where some of those investments need to be to ensure that we retain that ecosystem here and keep attracting investment into the UK.
So we kind of looked a little bit at the kind of innovation side of the zero investment vehicles, zero emissions vehicles. I suppose one of the big questions then is what can we do to implement that? Whether that's in supply chains, whether that's in the ecosystem as a whole. That's probably one for the whole panel, but Michael, perhaps if I start with you.
Timing's very good for Aston Martin. So last night we announced our technical relationship and supply relationship with Lucid. Interesting decision-making process. Lucid are in high power, one of the best in the world, but in terms of timing, we're perfect for Aston Martin. And really this, you would talk about excitement, for us this is great. We have the whole route map to our first PHEV, and then beyond that to our first BEV, in a way which we didn't have clarity before. So in terms of being able to plot out that future, it's very, very clear now. One of the things in this industry, and I think we failed with many governments to get this point across, and we saw that with the ZEV mandate discussions we had. A car takes around 48 months from the time the clear model's set to the time we have a car ready for production. And then in order to amortize the cost and make some money out of the product, it's normally about 7 years. So there's 11 years worth of future which is decided to take us right into the next decade. And at the moment, we're not really clear on what happens after 2030. So, we've got to get this message across that we can't react within 2 years to a mandate which is pretty threatening to the industry in order to remain competitive. Turn it back though, in terms of Aston Martin's future of electromobility, we've got a great partner and we're extremely excited about the news last night.
I think, just on that, I think, we've had very good positive news. We've launched our new SOA architecture, which is there to create that longevity of our product and offering as a fully BEV solution and offering different range of vehicle solutions at the larger end. Using supply chain efficiencies and looking at strategic partnerships within the parts bin activity that allows us to then build a stable platform on that. But I think without that longevity, without understanding the timeline that runs into our own activities in automotive, let alone the timelines that go into the suppliers' activities to then deliver that. If you look at just looking at raw materials and the mining operations that will take 20 years to go from conception to fully operational mines to start delivering the next level of precious metals that will go into these batteries, all of that needs to be baked in to say this can't be short-term activities. Otherwise, you end up in an A123 sort of battery situation where you create the space for innovation, you create something that is world-leading, that through lack of continued support fails, is adopted, and then you find that the US are bringing back in that technology but not owning it. And those sort of longer term strategies need to be there against that investment to drive with the supply chain to push it through.
I think on that as well, and giving another example, one of the things we're seeing, we've got a project at the moment called Recovus, which is looking at the recycling of batteries, but it's working. We've got a number of the OEMs, BMW involved in it, JLR involved in it, because nobody knows what the solution is. And what's really interesting is they're looking at how do they recoup their batteries and understand it. But not only that, we've got EMR, so looking at the recycling and the materials within it, UK BIT looking at how they improve the processing, so reducing energy costs. Warwick University are in there looking at how they can design better performance batteries. And so an Autocraft looking at the refurb. So, you've ended up with this whole ecosystem looking at how you develop that. Not only that, we've actually got the health and safety executive lot on there, because how do you manage this? So this is a point we're in this trajectory, in this transition of not only how do you make it more sustainable to get the materials out of the ground, but actually once we've got them out of the ground and we've started to use them, how do we recruit them back into the system? And is that back into the auto sector, or is that flow into a different sector? So again, this collaboration across all aspects of it is becoming more and more prevalent.
And maybe just to build on this, I think what you just heard and what was described is one of these key strengths of the UK, that we actually have that ecosystem that grows this, and then we need to translate this into the full supply chain. Now, last year at the summit, we looked at our supply chain, we scaled it up, and earlier this year we came out with another publication called Race to Net Zero, and we came out with our EV supplier directory. And the reason why we wanted to do this is because we want to give visibility to this emerging and growing industry, which actually has literally across the whole elements that will make our future value chain and supply chain capabilities here in UK in different places, whether they are in the projects that the APC looks after, or there are businesses already out there very, very active working with OEMs and battery suppliers. But what we need to do, and the directory has grown. It started with 180. We're now over 200, 250. It's growing all the time. And the reason is that we need to demonstrate where the partners could be, where the APC are, but we need to now use the strategy and the investment and the focus to really scale up our EV supply chain. There's no doubt about it. We need to do that. We need to secure some anchor investments here, and then we need to try and develop the rest of it. But we have a good starting point, and I think that's the positivity, hopefully.
And I suppose that looks at the supply chains of the future, but just as important is what the state of the supply chains are now. Michael, perhaps if I start with you, how are things looking in the luxury car segment in terms of supply chain resiliency?
I mean, we tend to work in sort of 3 layers of supplier. At the top you've got the great technology giants like Siemens, Continental, Bosch, who are extremely robust and on the forefront of new technology. And then we've got this middle section, which are the long-standing suppliers of everything else in the car. A headliner, a seat frame, an instrument panel. Unfortunately, in our sector, the thing that really trips us up is when you get down to almost the basic commodity base. So, for example, the example I always use are rubber sealing systems on a car. If you buy a small value car, you've got a sealing system on it, but you amortize the tooling costs over many millions of components. With an Aston Martin, which might be 2,000 components per year, we often run into trouble with what is an extremely complicated component. It's got to keep water out, it's got to keep wind noise out, it's got to make the car safe, no fume ingress into the car. So, if you look at those 3 layers, it's always the bottom layer which trips us up, apart from the global supply, the global chip problem that we had. So really it is at that most basic level. And this is where I think we need to make sure that we sometimes work together, with the small makers. What can we do within competitiveness rules where we work together to make sure that the low level, the SMEs of the country are robust and financially secure so that we can get continuous supply. That's where it's ended up with us at the moment, I think.
And Konstanze talked a little bit about kind of policy of the future. Chris, perhaps I could come to you in terms of how supportive you feel government policy is right now.
Feels like a loaded question. It's, I think that where we're at now, we're transitioning and we're all trying to understand what this future landscape looks like. And I think, as you heard today, that there is a desire to make sure that this is an attractive place to do business, for investment to follow, for automotive to thrive. And looking for the meat on those bones about what those policies are, how they actually drive that investment decision is to follow. And I think that all of us face internal business case activities where you're constantly trying to sort of recognize the true value within your business, within your supply chain, and the stability on which that investment will then be injected into. And I think for me, there's a lot of engagement going on now, which is crucial to deliver to very short time periods. And I'm just very encouraged by that level of conversation to try and drive what needs to be progressive, what needs to be fast, flexible, easy to do business with. We cannot hit these situations where we create a good package after, periods of assessment and activity to get to a point of things change. This industry is moving so fastly that they change, and we need to be able to adapt with those changes. We don't need to then be said, well, now you go back to the start of the activity and let's start again. It needs to be really fluid, really rapid, and engage with industry, understanding those constraints. I think that's my hope, that the next phase of regulations around this will be more precise and more flexible and just easy to do business with.
One thing I would say is, and I think we learned this through the ZEV mandate discussions, one size doesn't always fit all. We've got a fantastic diversity of car makers in the UK, from very high volume manufacturers like Nissan through to the small makers like our company. And we need to have dialogue with government so that we can identify where the differences might be, so that regulation might have to be tuned. I'm not saying that, the importance of 2030 and 2035 are very clear with all of the car makers. It's the journey to get there which is the difficult thing, and that's where I think we need this very open dialogue to make sure that the decisions we make are the right decisions.
Just to add to that, actually, though, I would say that, there has been a lot of engagement. I mean, we heard from the Auto Minister, Straughan, yesterday. She started this critical materials task and finish group, recognising the need for resilience and access to those materials for the UK. And she's regularly now coming to the Automotive Council, is actively engaged. We're hearing that from them. So the signals are looking positive. It's just the time at which it's implemented is key here.
Yeah, and if I could also just build on this one, I do think it's now about timely delivery. That's why we have this call for action, because the engagement, as we all said, is there, but the deep understanding of where our industry is at now, both in its structure, what it needs, it's not one size fits all, as well as the understanding, not just in the Department for Business, but across all the departments that are responsible for our regulatory frameworks, for the policies, whether that's in energy or whether that's around vehicle regulation, that they understand that these timelines that we are working to, that are so compressed because we need to deliver now on net zero, need to be accommodated and found a way forward so that everybody's being able to achieve, because that's where everybody wants to be.
I'm going to pull out that word understanding in that segment. Do you think there's enough clarity in the regulatory framework?
Well, I think on regulation, I think there's two things to say. So regulation is now a competitive element in any country's ability to deal with it. We are now post-Brexit, so post-Brexit regulatory frameworks need to really work for our industry going forward. And that means that a ZEV mandate needs to actually deliver. That's already coming in on the 1st of January. Needs to be mindful that for industries like ours, the certainty that our industry craves to be able to deliver to this needs to be taken into account. Obviously, the timescale is very, very compressed on that one. We need to get to a framework, whether that's on type approval or on other regulatory measures that are coming down the line, because our industry is highly regulated, that we have roadmaps going forward, that there's collaboration between industry, that we actually be able to measure our ability to both work at the global regulatory level, at the national regulator, and also with our partners in Europe, because most of what we produce go into Europe. So I think that's definitely to the improved measure, but it is also on to us as industry to work with policymakers to allow them to develop that new post-Brexit approach. But timescales and certainty is certainly what we hear from our members is really, really needed. The clarity beyond 2030, when we are sitting here in 2023, middle of 2023, is super important. So let's work on that make that a distinctive positive thing, that actually things like type approval don't become matters for headquarters, but actually they become ideally something that just works.
So are the timescales deliverable? Philippa, I don't know what your view on that is.
It's a difficult one, and as Konstanze's initiated, there's a lot of regulation set out there, and we have seen in the past that you set the goals and industry will probably moan about it but achieve it. One of the bigger challenges, I think, is that global perspective on this, and it was touched on by Chris from Volvo earlier and from Richard and Toyota, about this actually, how do we approach the sustainability and this holistic life cycle approach and looking at reducing carbon. And that's actually got to be a global challenge. We have global supply chains. We can't work at it in isolation. industrialisation, we've got to think about the relationships of both where we're importing materials from or components from and where we're exporting to. This is a global challenge, so agreements on prices of carbon or a framework in which the sector is going to go to is really important. The Automotive Council have had a few shout-outs today, but that brings industry together, and within that, I've been asked to chair a net zero manufacturing and supply chain group, and the engagement from across the OEMs, within the passenger car, off-highway, bus network, they all want to engage in a common framework here, along with the supply chain, to see how we all move together. Because I think one of the challenges we have here, and again, it leads back to the innovation piece, is, if you're a large OEM, you can probably implement the tools and the software that will help you develop your system, but as you flow down to your supply chain, it's them that will struggle to meet these demands and meet these requirements, and that's something we have to help the whole business transition to make sure the sector ultimately achieves net zero.
And if we look at the challenges from this morning, a lot of people talked about the fact that the UK can't do everything. We can't be exceptional at everything. Chris, Michael, to what extent are the niche and the luxury end vehicle manufacturing so core to what the UK might become?
I mean, from our perspective, we're a low volume manufacturer. We sort of lean heavily. We were 75% UK European sort of content. We're now sort of at 65% content. And I think, what we see is just the strains coming through where supply bases are having to make their own strategic adjustments against all of the challenges that they've faced, and just, as real examples that we face, we have suppliers saying, want to work with you, but we have to make a choice. We can only support 2 other small OEMs, and then we've got to prioritise our capacity into volume because too much uncertainty and stability there. So you end up sort of almost bidding with the suppliers and trying to sort of build that activity on, or you end up in suppliers that are in distress that you're trying to sort of pull along. And I guess for me, the biggest part within this is about partnership. It's about changing maybe the narrative that we have with our suppliers, trying to understand how we work with them better, how we find quick solutions. This isn't an ideal world to be delivering the perfect solution in all instances. Things wobble, and attitudes or activities in the past of tier ones you just need to deliver. What I sort of get encouraged by now is that the conversations are much more about how do we work with the tier ones, how do we recognise these vulnerabilities, how do we sort of create a supportive framework to sort of bring them along in the journey and trying to sort of keep them stable for the next iteration, because there are investments going on now into UK automotive. There's a huge appreciation and respect about what automotive can deliver, not just as the OEMs themselves, but the technical skills, knowledge, everything else, the supply chain that underpins it that's established here. I think it's, for me, there's just a piling up at the gates waiting for these strategies, these policies, everything to solidify so that it can be released and targeted in the right way, because it's big sums that we have to commit to, and then that filters down to the supply base that localises around it.
Michael, is that how you see the world?
Yeah, I think so. So what I found really interesting in reading the SMMT manifesto on the way down this morning was this great image of the prize, and the prize is huge for the UK. If we take the challenge, if we've got support and we can achieve it, and all of the OEMs do their bit. The counter to that is what happens if we don't, and we shouldn't even consider that side of the argument. We've got to look at what we have to do to win that prize. Our segment, the high luxury segment, is quite an interesting area of the car world, because actually there's no German manufacturer in that segment. It's either Italian, Ferrari, Lamborghini, or it's British, Rolls-Royce, Bentley, McLaren, and Aston Martin. And sometimes I think we lose sight of, although it's a very small segment of the overall car industry, it's extremely important for the UK. And also there's a halo effect. We just have to take our cars to certain parts of the world, take the DB12 launch in Cannes, and there's a whole warmth towards Britishness, a whole warmth towards the skills that we've got in luxury. So therefore, I think the prize is pretty big, not just from a financial perspective, but also what the UK is all about. So my view is it's incredibly important. But as Konstanze said earlier, the clock is ticking. We've got to make sure we've got all of the prerequisites in place to make sure that we can deliver this. And to answer your question was about, can we deliver everything on our own? No, we can't. And that was part of our agreement with Lucid. We can't do everything, but certainly we need parts of this supply chain to be here and available in the UK.
So We're going to have a few minutes at the end, and we'll definitely be putting some questions from the audience, and we'll tee up nicely. But there's going to be a more pessimistic last question, which is time running out? And Konstanze, maybe one to start with you.
Well, the boat hasn't left yet, but the engines are running, and that's why I think we all want governments and politicians to really grasp the opportunity to work with us and really put us on the map and keep us on the map going forward. So I'm definitely more than a glass half full person. We've just talked all day about the diversity and the strengths and the capabilities in this industry. Let's galvanize it. Let's bring it together now, communicate it, and get it out there. So the confidence in the industry itself and all our new partners with whom we need to want to deal and want to get over here can be established and grown. So yeah, no, we are definitely needing to act now, but the boat isn't left.
Well, I promised a bit of optimism at the start, and I think you've delivered a little bit of optimism at the end. With that in mind, are there any questions from the audiences? I can see that we've got microphones standing ready, and I can see a gentleman who's already grabbed a microphone, so he's ideally placed to kick off.
Simon Godwin from Borg Warner. To meet the increasingly ambitious regulations for ZEVs and for CO2 in the EU, in the UK, and also in the US, there's a concern that a lot of the demands will be met by electric vehicles that come from China. So do you see that as a threat or a good thing? And what about the measures that have been discussed, for example, to counter that? Do you see that as a threat as well, for example, to the open trading relationship that Konstanze was talking about?
Happy to kick it off. I mean, I think the UK market has always been an open market. We've got probably one of the most diverse. The European market is pretty competitive as well in this. So what we really are talking about here is that what we need to do is establish in the UK and in the wider European industry the best condition to be competitive, to actually thrive in this, to be able to offer the technologies and the products at the price and at the convenience of our customers that are competitive going forward. So from our perspective, would we see it as a threat? Not, but we see it as a spur to actually do what we are talking about here at pace.
I just think there's a lot of optimism in what the UK European market can offer, and that's why you're drawing in competitive brands that are coming in. But the whole supply chain that goes around it, it's not just enough to land a vehicle and say, right, we're taking our market share, because you still need all the service network, aftermarket support. You still want to localize the manufacturing content where you can to create efficiencies and alignment with your product and the market that you're operating within. So, for me, I think competitiveness isn't a bad thing. I think that yes, we may have missed the starting pistol and now we just need to get off and run with the rest of the competition. But I don't see it so much as a threat. I just see it as a way of maturing our market and just seeing the opportunities, because these Chinese brands as well, they have their liquidity problems, they have their fierce competition. I just think it shows where we need to be accelerating what we're good at and delivering into that supply chain, into that sort of product offering that is growing. And I think it's a positive indication of what we can deliver from the UK and Europe.
I think I'd add to that. It's about the anchoring of the innovation and the growth of innovation that we see. So, for example, if you take a company like Equipmake, initially they worked with aerial, so niche vehicle network, and again, a sector we're very proud of here in the UK, to accelerate the development of that technology. We've then seen that technology spill into the bus network, but also into the maritime area. So that's a real growth in capability that we have here. We also need to make sure that some of that technology that we have is also exported, and we keep that export market, recognising that's a big strength that we have here in the sector. But also, I think the key thing here is making sure that we aren't worried about foreign investment here in the UK, because actually some of that investment is required. We are still seen as innovation leaders, and we saw that with the acquisition of YESA, for example, from the most technology through Mercedes. But that's actually growing the capability here, growing the manufacturing capability in those jobs and creation of jobs here in the UK. So anchoring that capability here. So that's all still positive for us in terms of meeting some of these future needs.
I think we've probably got time for one more question, if we've got any from the room. I can see a lady over there, if we can get a microphone to her.
Hi, Emma Martin from Bosch. I don't agree 100% with the panel. Obviously, I heard that you said the supply chain can be localized depending on the need. I don't think that the supply chain functions that way. We localize only if the quantity is given, which makes the whole supply chain efficient. And I think also the other point, and I will ask my question quickly, about the battery manufacturing, I think the boat is missed because the supply chain is already done and dusted in China. So if we're looking into new areas of supply chain to come here, or maybe we're talking about supply chain resilience, then we could consider, but then the quantity has to be given. And this is the dilemma, is a chicken and egg. And the problem what we are facing here, if you don't have a long-term strategy planning, it will struggle, the OEMs and suppliers will struggle to decide about the supply chain. So it's always about thinking ahead and thinking really about what kind of new technologies can be then localized in time. And my question really here for the panel is, what realistically you think, moving forward technology-wise, can be considered to be localized realistically in the UK?
Well, I can see that because that was a difficult question, I've got wrap it up on displaying on my screen. So Konstanze, I might ask for just a very brief response from you before we thank our panelists.
Well, I think, Aman, I think from my perspective, obviously we need to look at all the technologies that are coming forward that you were hinting at in terms of the opportunities here. But it is we need to look at it really pragmatically. There are OEMs here, investors that have partners, some find new partners, we innovate, new ones come forward. And with these partners, we need to try and localize what there is and get the investment going when that company is in that right point of investment. And I think that logic is not changing, but what we need to do is put the right ecosystem, the right competitive and business environment in place that will secure it here. So we can continue to argue whether the boat is gone or not. I would err on the side of positivity, that actually there are still big bets to be made by the investors we've got here, because they're in different stages of the transformation. But I think to your point, it is open, to those technologies, battery electric. Philippa was talking about also hydrogen and other things that are going forward, and that's the exciting bit about this transformation.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if I can ask you to say thank you in the usual way to our wonderful panelists. Just a reminder, you will also find the manifesto within your digital program as well.